Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Sir Michael Howard Centre for the History of War, the School of Security Studies at King's College London, I would like to welcome you here today. My name is Jonathan Fennell. I'm one of the co-directors of the Sir Michael Howard Centre and co-organiser of this conference, and David Morgan-Owen is the other co-organiser who I think you met at reception, the gentleman with the dapper bow tie. Without David's organisational skills, this event certainly wouldn't happen today. So, indeed, we'd like to thank you all for coming, especially in light of the terrorist attack in London on Saturday night. I'm sure we all agree that we must not allow ourselves to be intimidated by such acts, and indeed the high turnout here today shows that we are not. Sir Michael Howard has sent his best wishes and blessings for today, which he has kindly said promises to be of exceptional interest. I can only chafe more bitterly than ever, he wrote, at the inhibitions imposed by age that prevents me from attending the conference or deriving much benefit from it if I did. Having set the ball rolling all those years ago, I'm still passionately interested in the course of military history, and I'm fascinated by the direction in which a new generation of historians seek to guide it. The genesis of this conference dates back a couple of years. Historians at the Defence Studies Department at King's set up the Research Centre for the History of Conflict to develop the research output and reputation of DSD in the fields of military history, diplomatic, colonial and other related history. With about 30 scholars working on the history of war, we wanted to start punching at our weight. So we thought additionally that we should organise events aimed at engaging with the big questions regarding our subdiscipline of military history. In the past year, we've made considerable strides along the path to achieving these goals. We've had conferences on topics such as the First and Second World Wars, Cold War, air power history, and others. In the last few months, the Research Centre for the History of Conflict has merged with the Sir Michael Howard Centre for the History of War on the Strand, and the new merged centre, which will keep the Sir Michael Howard name, and brings together what we believe to be the largest community of historians of war in the world. Across the departments of Defence Studies, War Studies, History and English, we have about 50 scholars working on this topic. With any luck, God is on the side of the big battalions. Today's event, which has been generously funded by a Faculty of Social Science and Public Policy C grant, is partly the next step in DSD's original ambition to play a greater role in the future of our subject, and perhaps more importantly, an opportunity to celebrate the cooperation and potential of the new merged Sir Michael Howard Centre. Today we will hear papers and case studies relating to the evolution of military history, where it is today and perhaps where it is going in the future. The event aims to foster an open dialogue about how scholars have studied and written about the history of conflict in the past, current developments in the field, how we might promote innovative approaches and methodologies, and interdisciplinary collaboration in the study of war. In fact, in many ways, I'd refer to the ideas you're about to hear as provocations more than papers. We don't expect you, this audience, to simply sit and listen to our speakers. We've purposely asked our presenters to talk for 10 to 15 minutes in order to allow time for debate and discussion. We will record the event and put it up on the Sir Michael Howard Centre website in the expressed understanding that we will learn as much from the cut and thrust and exchange ideas between us as we will from the provocations of our speakers. With that aim in mind, for those who use Twitter, the hashtag for the event today is WHCP17. I think you can see it up there. War and Historical and Contemporary Perspective 17, WHCP17. The more experience one gets, the more one realises that days like this are really quite special. We've probably about 90 scholars in the room here today. By being exposed to multiple perspectives and approaches, we open ourselves up to new ideas. New groups and collaborations can develop and new research projects can emerge. We may not produce a definitive statement regarding the future of military history today. That is not necessarily our goal. Rather, we aim to encourage historical debate and theoretical and practical discussion. It is incumbent on us to be inquisitive and passionate about reflecting on the subdiscipline of military history. To employ a term commonly used in modern sport, to look for incremental gains. The small improvements in insight and understanding that over time add up to new schools of thinking or study. Marginal improvements in understanding is worth seeking, I think. Indeed, one could argue this is the only manner in which steps forward actually take place. So, to the business end. Our event today will comprise 3 panels investigating 3 main themes: the study of war within the broader discipline of history, the place of historical studies within war studies, and how the people who study the history of war shape the discipline. The panels will be bookended by 2 keynotes, the first from one of our rising stars of defence studies, Dr. Michael Finch, and the second by perhaps the biggest name in the study of the history of war, Professor Sir Hugh Strachan. Without further ado, let me hand you over to our first keynote, Mike Finch. Mike was awarded a doctorate in modern history from the University of Oxford in 2010. He went on to take up a 2-year postdoc on the changing character of war programme at Oxford and then joined defence studies at King's in 2013, and he's never looked back. Mike's areas of interest range from French colonial pacification to intellectual history. His doctorate was published by OUP in 2013 under the title of Progressive Occupation, the Gallieni-Lotté Method and Colonial Pacification in Tonkin and Madagascar. Mike, who was recently awarded a BA Small Grant and has articles published in a number of high-end journals, is going to talk to us today on the subject of Always a Marginal Pursuit, Academic Military History in the 20th Century.
Well, this is in no way nerve-wracking. Thank you very much to Dave and to Johnny for allowing me to have the dubious pleasure of opening the talks at today's session. I'm going to talk today about the position of military history in an academic sense in the 20th century. And as you already heard, the title under which I'm speaking is Always a Marginal Discipline, although I do sort of wonder, as with my book, whether this is another case in which I'm developing a tendency to throw question marks on the end of things that don't really need them. Nevertheless, military historians often seem to find themselves in dispute with others within the historical community over their place within the wider discipline. When this plays out online, over articles, blog posts, and comment sections, it usually tends to happen something like this. The military historian notes that military history has great popular appeal, but it's held in little regard by other professional historians who are either indifferent or actively hostile to it. This, in turn, results in an unsympathetic response from the non-military historian, irritated by what they see as a woe is me argument that masks resentment at the growth and expansion of other specializations. A notable feature I find of such debates, whether this is stated outright or implied, is the premise that at some point in the past, military history occupied a privileged position within the academy. In 2016, for example, amongst the responses to an internet lament over the absence of courses on US military history in American universities, one could read the following. Firstly, from the late 19th century through to the 1950s, military history was history. Along with diplomatic and political history, it dominated the scholarly study of the past. Secondly, history departments used to be only focused on political and military history, at least up until the 1920s. These comments relate specifically to the United States, of course, but I would also suggest that they are fairly indicative of the prevailing assumptions in the UK as well. Yet, however reassuring it may be to build arguments on such foundations, whether to uphold a narrative of tragic decline or to celebrate the diversification of the fields of historical inquiry, this idea of a golden age of military history within universities is a myth. Indeed, as the 20th century began, military history had very little presence on either side of the Atlantic. In the United States, it's notable that when in 1912 the American Historical Association hosted a conference on military history as part of its annual meeting, this was considered an exceptional occurrence, not a routine one. It was occasioned by the efforts of a number of members who saw that, The point of view towards military events and their relation to civil history and to the destinies of the nation has somewhat altered, and that it is to the advantage of the American people that there should be a more intelligent understanding of military history with a view to the protection of the nation in the near future. That is to say, military history had transformed sufficiently that it was possible to at least consider its potential as a subfield. One speaker, Professor Robert N. Johnson of Harvard University, put it plainly, remarking that in military history we have abandoned the drum and trumpet and begun to analyse the psychology of generals, on the documents critically examined and their tactical and strategical methods as seen from a technical point of view. Yet despite these encouraging developments, Johnston considers that his half course, as he described it, delivered only intermittently to students at Harvard, was the only such course to exist in the United States at that time. More progress had been made in Britain, particularly in Oxford. Here, the presence of military history within the university had traditionally been contingent on the research interests of individual college fellows. At the turn of the 20th century, there were a few of these. Charles Firth, Fellow of All Souls, then Regius Professor of Modern History from 1905 to 1925, and author of Cromwell's Army, amongst other works on the English Civil War era. Sir Charles Mann, another All Souls Fellow and Chichely Professor of Modern History from 1905, best known, of course, for his 7-volume History of the Peninsular War. A lesser-known figure was C.T. Atkinson, Fellow of Exeter from 1898 to 1941, and described by John Hattendorf as the preeminent teacher of military history in his era. In 1905, however, the university created a lectureship in military history, funded by a secret donation from the Warden of All Souls, William Anson. A fellow of the same college, Sir Foster Cunliffe, was elected to the position, charged with the delivery of no fewer than 25 lectures across 2 terms on military history, not confined to any special period of history, but in all cases bearing upon the conditions of modern warfare. In 1909, the lectureship was superseded when Henry Spencer Wilkinson was chosen as the first Chichely Professor in military history. These early efforts at establishing military history within the university, it must be said, were as much the product of military desires as they were of academic ones. The creation of a dedicated position in military history was driven by the desire to provide for a higher quality of military education in the wake of recriminations in the aftermath of the South African War. So the primary requirement of the lecturer in military history was then to instruct students hoping to progress to a military career from their university studies, who were required to take the military history examination. Under the arrangement brokered between the history faculty and the War Office, that exam consisted of the study of a campaign chosen from a period running from 1792 to 1878. The War Office retained the final say over the choice of campaign, signalling early on its desire to change it on a regular basis. Ostensibly, this was intended to ensure that future officers scrutinised a campaign that the War Office considered to be of contemporary relevance. But I suspect it may also have been to minimise the potential for cheating. Either way, it proved a source of immediate frustration for the lecturer in military history, who found that preparing lectures and sourcing appropriate reading material for a movable target a near impossible task. The more so given his students' general inability to master the foreign language works necessary to study continental campaigns. In a report to the History Faculty Board at the end of his tenure in 1908, Cunliffe recommended that the faculty take control over the choice of campaign and fix it for a number of years. Spencer Wilkinson, in his role as Chichely Professor, found the need to balance past and present to be a similar source of frustration. That necessity rose from the statutes that created the chair, which set out, in terms that echoed those laid down for the lectureship in military history, that the professor should give lectures and instruction with special reference to the conditions of modern warfare. Wilkinson's increasingly vocal objections to this requirement helped ensure that his successor would not have to labour under the same constraints. Anson's successor as Warden of All Souls, Francis Pember, was able to remove from the statutes the offending obligation, arguing that this imposed limitations on the professor's area of research and implied that the chair existed primarily to provide for military education, which he insisted it did not. Such moves could be understood as the first steps towards a civilianized academic military history in the United Kingdom. And there were other encouraging developments as well. Under the guidance of a man in Atkinson, in 1924, the military history special subject settled as a study of the Peninsular War using British and military diplomatic documents. Using British military and diplomatic documents. It would retain this form until 1950. And during the 1920s and 30s, a smattering of graduate students began to conduct research in matters related to military and naval affairs. The significance of such developments should not be overstated, however. For one thing, the number of students opting for the special subject in military history tended to be low. Oman and Atkinson reported that prior to 1924, they struggled to reach double digits. And despite Pember's efforts to widen the possibilities for Wilkinson's successor, in 1925, the electors to the Churchilly professorship chose a soldier rather than a civilian to fill the 2-year-old vacancy. The successful candidate, Major General Sir Ernest Swinton, is best known today as an advocate of the tank during the First World War. He'd also served as head of the historical section on the Committee of Imperial Defence for 3 years prior to that conflict, during which time he had overseen the compilation of the official history of the Russo-Japanese War. Despite this, during his tenure, he published little in the way of academic research. In the words of Sir Hugh Strawn, as an engineer and railway expert, he was a scientist rather than a historian. But furthermore, to compound this, the major concerns that he expressed in his inaugural lecture were more contemporary than historical. So, as the Second World War approached, it could hardly be said that an Oxford School of Military History had formed. Reliant on the capability of a handful of individuals, any gains made could be easily reversed. Indeed, by the time Swinton retired in 1939, even the future of the Churchilly professorship was in doubt. As Sir Basil Littlehart later recounted, this was a direct consequence of dissatisfaction with Swinton's performance, which led to a proposal to abolish the chair and transfer its endowment to another subject. The crisis was only averted in 1940, when the electors opted to leave the post unfilled for the duration of the war. While the Churchilly professorship then remained vacant, across the Atlantic, the Second World War brought new opportunities. Until that point, matters seem to have hardly progressed since the 1912 AHA conference ended with a resolution to form a committee to consider how the study and presentation of military history might be furthered. That initiative went nowhere. Consequently, by the 1930s, there were as few opportunities for military historians as there had been 30 years earlier. Late on in his life, the Duke University historian Theodore Ropp reflected that American military historians were as numerous then as lion tamers, noting also that there were no graduate courses in military history available when he became eligible for one in 1934. The war did not result in the immediate proliferation of courses in military history, but the scale and stakes of the century's second global conflict lent to military studies an importance and an urgency that had hitherto been denied to it. One of the most important figures to capitalise on the opportunity this presented was Edward Meade Earle. Though little remembered in subsequent decades due to the paucity of his individual scholarly output, as well as to his early death, Earle had been an advocate for the study of war since joining the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton in 1934. In 1939, he founded a seminar in American foreign relations, which would in time morph into the Princeton Military Studies Group, and which he described in 1942 as forming a centre d'études militaires, which is not concerned with the immediate technical military and naval problems, but rather with broad questions of national strategy, military security, the elements of military and economic power, and the role of the United States in world politics. Earle's seminar united historians, economists, and political scientists in pursuit of a shared goal. Yet whilst much of its work was, unsurprisingly, focused on the present, the volume which is frequently seen as its most enduring output was decidedly more historical. Although that volume, Makers of Modern Strategy, Military Thought from Machiavelli to Hitler, extended its analysis to include aspects of the war still in progress, the content of the work was overwhelmingly provided by historians. And more important to note is that many of these contributors were not, at least until that point, military historians. This included Earl. When, in the 1980s, the IAS began to compile a publication detailing the work of its members since foundation, Felix Gilbert, one of Earl's contributors, was moved to request that for Earl's entry, behind his name and before military historian, it would be desirable to insert either modern history or international relations, since his published work in military history was small and his interests ranged far beyond the field of military history. For Gordon Craig, meanwhile, he admitted later in life that the German military historian Hans Delbruck, who was assigned to him as a young and pliable academic, was, until that point, unknown to him. So in this manner, interaction with Earl's project could turn academics into military historians. Certainly this was the view of Theodore Ropp, trained in political and diplomatic history, who considered writing a chapter for the volume a key milestone in his emergence as a military historian. Yet, just as it had been the case before the war, the advances made at the IAS were limited. Makers of Modern Strategy proved to be an influential primer for the next generation of military historians, but it fell well short of Walter Lippmann's hyperbolic claim that it would establish the study of military history and the development of military doctrine as an indispensable subject in higher education and the intellectual life of the nation. Perhaps more importantly, Earl's supposed Centre d'études militaires proved to be an ephemeral creation that declined after 1945 and disappeared with the death of its founder in 1954. The IAS did not capitalize on Earl's initiatives. Indeed, institutional memory of his wartime activities was so quickly lost that, as we have seen, it was left to Felix Gilbert to attempt to resurrect them at the beginning of the 1980s. Moreover, since Earl's group encompassed a greater diversity of academics than just historians, some of whom, such as Bernard Brodie, went on to gain far more recognition than their sponsor, it has been possible to cast Earl and his project as a prototype more for security studies in the USA than for military history. Military history, then, did not emerge from the Second World War, firmly rooted in American universities. Nevertheless, the experience of war had done enough to encourage, into the 1950s, a gentle rise in the number of military history courses offered. A comparative study by John Bowditch of the course catalogues of 30 leading universities before and after the war puts matters into relief. He found that during the academic year 1935 to 36, next to no military or naval courses were offered across these institutions, other than those that were mandated legally for Reserve Officer Training Corps, and which were taught predominantly by military personnel. In 1951-52, by comparison, 10 of the universities had introduced undergraduate or graduate courses on military or naval history, and a further 2 offered courses on the Second World War. In 1954, a larger study found that of 493 colleges and universities, 37 such institutions either offered or intended to create courses on military-related matters within their history department. In Britain, the end of the war brought with it a return to normal routines. In Oxford, things began to look the same way as they had during the 1930s. In 1946, the electors of the Chicheley Professorship convened to choose a successor to Swinton, opting for Captain Cyril Falls, military correspondent of the Times and an official historian of the First World War. A small number of college fellows, Atkinson until the late 1950s, as well as younger fellows such as Piers Mackesy, continued to provide teaching and supervision for students of military history. Events that took place at King's College London a few years later were of more significance. Here, in 1953, Sir Michael Howard was tasked with revitalising the military studies department. Howard had joined King's in 1947 as an assistant lecturer in the history department, promoted to full lecturer in 1950. By the time he was appointed lecturer in military studies, he was still, by his own admission, searching for a suitable research project. Nevertheless, he came to the job with some favourable attributes. He had a record of distinguished service in the Italian campaign, and he had also co-authored a regimental history of the Coldstream Guards, his regiment, which appeared in 1951. But researching and writing that volume had been a checkered experience. It brought him to understand, in his own words, why I had always found military history rather dull. Although by the same token, the experience meant that he now knew where the problem lay. The military studies department that Howard inherited had roots in the mid-19th century, when a department for military science had existed for a number of years. In more recent times, in 1927, the college had appointed Major General Sir Frederick Morris, one of the shortlisted candidates to replace Spencer Wilkinson as a professor of military studies. Despite this appointment, the department did not flourish. By the time the Second World War began, it functioned predominantly as a provider of staff courses to officers in the Territorial Army, and was wound up a few years later. In 1953, Howard recognised the opportunity that had been presented and used it to transform military studies into war studies, with lasting effects for military historians in the United Kingdom. Howard's success was built upon broadening the scope of inquiry in the study of conflict as a whole. In the first instance, however, this meant reconsidering the parameters of military history. During the sabbatical granted him in order to prepare for his new role, Howard came to the conclusion that the history of war was more than the operational history of armed forces. It was the study of entire societies. This, it might be added, was a direct consequence of reading Earle's Makers of Modern Strategy and following up on its references, particularly the work of Hans Delbruck. Yet he was equally cognizant that war studies had to interest the economists, the international lawyers, the social scientists, the international relations specialists, and even, if possible, the scientists. The courses created by the department corresponded to that desire. First came a war studies course for the University of London's BA General degree. This was followed in 1965 by the establishment of an MA in War Studies, and finally, in 1992, by a BA in War Studies. In this manner, King's War Studies provided a blueprint for other universities to follow, with centres for war studies established over subsequent decades in places such as Birmingham, Glasgow, and Wolverhampton, and with BA and MA courses in war studies established in those institutions and many others besides. In all these places, military history and military historians have played important roles. In keeping with the interdisciplinary mission of war studies, Howard's successors as head of the department have not, for the most part, been historians. Yet even if Howard recognised that the role of war studies was not, in his words, simply or indeed primarily to turn out military historians, nevertheless war studies, I would suggest, has been responsible for producing the largest number of British-trained military historians in the post-war era. The list is far too long to recite, but to give just some indication of how prolific the department has been, amongst my historian colleagues at the Defence Studies Department, the number who completed part or all of their studies within war studies stands in the double figures. That's in a department of around 50-odd academics. If war studies offered a new home for an increasing number of military historians from the 1950s onwards, in the United States, the process of expansion that began in the 1950s continued into subsequent decades. In a 1975 survey, Maurice Matloff noted that there were at least 110 institutions offering specialised courses of one kind or another in military history, not counting ROTC courses, which he considered a remarkable development. At the same time, an increasing number of doctorates were awarded. Matloff estimated that by the mid-1970s, about 10% of the dissertations in academic history in recent years related to military history, to military subjects, with some undertaken even in universities that do not teach courses in military history. A more precise survey found that whereas around 100 doctoral dissertations in military history were produced between 1949 and 1953, between 1961 and 1970, more than 500 were either completed or ongoing. And more recent evidence suggests that the growth of academic military history in the US has continued more or less up to the present. A 2015 study of trends in historical specialization covering a 40-year period beginning in 1975, compiled by the AHA's Directory of History Departments, Historical Organizations, and Historians, showed that military history was one of 11 topical fields of specialization which experienced growth over those years. Admittedly, that growth has been very gentle. The 2.6% share of faculty registered in 2015 stood only slightly higher than it had in 1975. But if this seems a meagre increase, it should also be noted that other specializations, such as social, intellectual, and diplomatic history, have experienced more sustained decline over this period. So, when considered across the breadth of the 20th century, and indeed into the 21st century, such trends suggest that the progress of military history, of academic military history, can actually be seen as a minor success story, perhaps even a marginal success story, might be a better way of putting it. The plain fact of the matter is that at the beginning of the 20th century, military history barely had a presence within the university on either side of the Atlantic. After the Second World War, this was no longer the case. There is a story here of an emerging historical specialization, not one in terminal decline, even if, in the UK at least, that success was largely found outside of history departments. But of course, it's not as simple as that. The fortunes of military history and the attitudes of military historians cannot wholly be explained in isolation from the progress of other historical specializations. And of course, one of the points that it's worth making is that if, in the decades after the Second World War, military history experienced a period of growth, this was only part of a broader process of expansion in higher education, which benefited historians of many stripes. And the aforementioned survey of the AHA's directory is also illuminating in setting the growth of military history in context, since it shows that even some of the specializations that experienced decline between 1975 and 2015 have enjoyed consistently higher representation than military history. Intellectual history, for example, declined from around 11% of faculty to around 4.5%, while social history fell from 11% to just over 8%. Meanwhile, the success of other specializations is startling. Women's and gender history, for example, which accounted for less than 1.5% of historians in 1975, rose to around 10% by 2015. Cultural history increased from less than 4% to almost 8% over the same period. So when set alongside the astonishing growth of some specializations and the seemingly perennial presence of others, it perhaps becomes a little easier to see why some military historians might feel themselves to be underrepresented. To compound this impression, the gentle rise of military history has not been achieved without setbacks. And it does seem that some of the most testing times appear to have been the most recent. From around 1995, the AHA survey shows that the number of military historians declined consistently until 2005, when it hit its lowest share, just 1.8%. It's probably not coincidental that around the same time, concerned voices began to suggest that the success of other specializations came at a direct cost to military history. In 1997, for example, John Lynn contended that, to quote him, "When we, the tenured retire, disappear, or are assassinated by our own disillusioned graduate students, it is unlikely that our positions will be filled by other military specialists," citing the non-replacement of a number of recently retired distinguished military historians at some leading institutions as evidence of this trend. Matt Kaufman at Wisconsin, John Shai and Gerald Lindemann at Michigan, and Gunther Rottenberg at Purdue. Of course, the suspicion that historians in other subfields might be only too pleased to see the demise of academic military history reflects a much longer-standing insecurity on the part of military historians regarding their perceived lack of standing, even a lack of legitimacy within the historical community. The notion that military historians are seen by their colleagues as ultimately politically right-wing, morally corrupt, or just plain dumb is remarkably persistent. Defenders of military history have long ascribed this stance to the liberal tradition of mainstream historical studies, which considers war an abhorrence. In a 1955 lecture at King's College London, for example, Norman Gibbs, Cyril Fall's successor as Chicheley Professor at Oxford, referred to the well-established tradition that history stops on the day that wars break out and begins again with the signing of peace. What happens in between is a no man's land, fit for exploration by teachers and students at staff colleges, but not by respectable historians. To stray any further into the business of war would risk fueling what Sir Michael Howard described in his influential essay on the use and abuse of military history as a certain fear in academic circles, where military history is liable to be regarded as a handmaid of militarism, that its chief use may be propagandist and myth-making. Since the 1970s, I would argue, some military historians have also pointed to a certain process of mirroring on the part of their detractors to account for this hostility. John Lynn, again, has been vocal on this score, writing as recently as 2008 that many historians tend to empathise with their subjects and see the peoples they study as admirable, although often oppressed, women, racial minorities, and workers. They seem at times to extrapolate from their own kind of commitment, reaching the conclusion that military historians must like, or at least approve of war and its horrendous costs. The military historian's lack of obvious social cause becomes evidence of his or her perverted values. The long-standing riposte, again, of the military historian has been the most obvious one. To study war is not to condone it. But this has not always been an effective response. In the aftermath of the Second World War, the idea that, to quote Ropp, a generation of historians could not ignore this branch of human activity because we do not like it or believe in it or because it's very difficult for us to understand, carried with it a certain force for those who had experienced it. The same was not true of the United States in the era of Vietnam, when campus antagonism between military and non-military historians became more pronounced. Yet even here we can observe a paradoxical effect, for whilst the professional standing of military historians amongst their peers appeared to hit its nadir in the late 60s and early 70s, the history of war still retained its capacity to attract students. Matt Kaufman, for example, noted that during this time at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, an epicenter of student protest, enrollment in his American military history course peaked at double what it would be later. And by the 1990s, Peter Perret was able to reflect that it was during this period that, almost imperceptibly, a change set in which has now gone far to raise interest in the historical interpretation of war and its attendant elements and place it on a firmer, less contentious footing in American colleges and universities. So the deeply ingrained suspicion on the part of some military historians that they are not held in much esteem by their peers is perhaps not wholly unfounded, but nor is it wholly accurate. And indeed, I would suggest that focusing on the academic battles lost, which military historians have a tendency to do, can obscure the fact that military history has always had its allies as well as its adversaries. Sir Michael Howard, for example, was given his great opportunity here at King's thanks to the efforts of fellow historians, Sir Charles Webster and Sir Keith Hancock, as well as the economist Lionel Robbins. Nor should the efforts of people such as Warden Anson of All Souls in moving to create the Chicheley Professorship, or IAS Director Frank Adelod in supporting the work of Edward Meade Earle be forgotten. It should also not be forgotten that since the Second World War, military historians have sometimes actually been their own most strident critics. This tendency, it seems, arose initially from the tribulations of a young academic specialization and the feeling that it lagged behind other subfields. There is no field, wrote Ropp in 1949, in which the bibliography is quite as overwhelming and none in which so little has been done to systematise what has already been accomplished. With the passage of time, this could give way to outright frustration at the seemingly arrested disciplinary development of military history, so much that it could prompt of Peter Perret to ask bluntly in 1966, is there any other field of historical research whose practitioners are equally parochial, or as poorly informed on the work of their foreign colleagues, particularly those publishing in languages other than English, and show as little concern about the theoretical innovations and disputes that are today transforming the study and writing of history? Military history has, of course, come a long way since 1966. And as a number of eloquent commentators have argued, it is possible to view it as drawing strength from an unprecedented diversity. As Robert Cetino wrote in a 2007 article for the American Historical Review, contemporary military history constitutes the very epitome of a big tent, under which military historians continue to pursue a research agenda that in its breadth and sophistication takes a backseat to no other area of historical inquiry, encompassing war and society, operational history, and memory and culture approaches. In a similar vein, the authors of a recent study on the place of the military in US civic education discovered that academics' perceptions of the health of the field were wedded to their definitions of military history. Self-described new military historians felt far more positive about both the present and the future than those traditional military historians who saw their more battle-oriented colleagues retire without like-for-like replacements. And yet the stigma about military history persists. To quote a 2016 review, that it suffers from the odour of bad method and bad politics, which relegate it to a dark corner in universities from which it still struggles to emerge. Why is this? To my mind, it cannot be wholly explained by arguing that non-military historians have not paid enough attention to the intricacies of military history as a specialisation, although this must play a part. Perhaps we need to make more allowance for the possibility that military historians are not nearly as united as is sometimes supposed. This is not just a question of the hostility of some traditional military historians towards those who choose to write about war minus the fighting, although I'm sure that this continues to exist. It's also a question of how many of those who practice, for example, a war in history approach would ever describe what they do as military history. The labels matter. Indeed, the experience of military history in the 20th century bears this out. If they did not, why transform an Oxford professorship in military history into a professorship in the history of war? Why transform a King's Department of Military Studies into a Department of War Studies? Sir Michael Howard once admitted that he was always a little uneasy when described as a military historian. And I suspect that many others find this a similar source of discomfort, but consent to it for day-to-day ease. Perhaps as a consequence, military history remains too easily equated with operational history, which does not do justice to its scope and purpose. I cannot help but wonder whether insistence on the idea of a specialisation not in military history, but in the history of war, as a more inclusive banner under which a greater diversity of historians could toil, might have helped to enable greater academic success across the 20th century. Thank you.
Audience. If questioners could state their name and their institution, and I'll hand this out and we can get everything recorded. Who wants to have a crack first? Thanks, you.
Oh, God. I knew this.
I didn't want to ask the first question, but as there was a moment of silence, Mike, thank you for that. You were heavily Atlantic in your focus, and you're, after all, a historian of France. I'm tempted to ask, why not look to Europe? Partly because many of those people did. I mean, Michael Howard did himself. Spencer Wilkinson most certainly did, and had regular exchanges with French and German scholars. Because I mean, there is clearly, Germany is a problem for obvious reasons because of its own difficulties with Wehrwissenschaft and what happened after the 1930s. But they too have had a similar debate. I remember Jürgen Förster coming to Glasgow and we were discussing the place of the history of war. And he said, we can't call it the history of war because that's Kriegsgeschichte. We can study Militärgeschichte because that implies war and society, if we talk about militaries in history rather than war. And France, similarly, despite all the attention to military history in the professional world, at the École de Guerre and so on, has actually struggled in some ways to place military history within the academic profession, and yet there are clear highlights. I mean, I just wonder how the narrative would look there. I mean, Germany, because of the break of Hitler and the effects of the Second World War, provides a contrast. But France seems to me, despite 1940's defeat, to provide an example where you expect a more continuous evolution in the same way as you might see British or American evolution.
I mean, it's very interesting. I mean, actually, my impression would be that if I tried to weave that into a story of the growth of military history, that my sort of automatic assumption is that it adds a sort of a flourishing coda to the end of it, because my impression has always been that actually it's only in more recent times that more very recent decades that you see that kind of coming together of what would be considered in the UK more operationally focused military history, moving that into the civil sphere. So if anything, I think the reason why that makes it hard to tell that story is because it is much more contemporary than historical. I mean, to be quite honest, also, it's sort of driven by the fact that the research that I've conducted in this area has moved in a completely different tangent from the research that I do into French history.
Can I just add a very quick coda? Le Monde, about a month ago, had an article of a new book out called La Ruse en Guerre, which is about deception and strategy.
Yeah.
And it said this is an interesting new development from the English-speaking world, which is war studies, a recognition, if you like, of exactly that. And the author is in at ESM. In other words, he's in a military establishment.
That's quite interesting, because I actually was. I met with a friend who works for SM just the other week, who said that they've suddenly become very interested. Her boss has become very interested in war studies, and the frustration that there is no kind of equivalent within France, and that there should be one. Yeah.
Stephen and then Lawrence.
Thank you for that. Stephen Badds, University of Wolverhampton. First, thanks for the mention of my department. That wouldn't have happened 5 years ago. But we're still rather fragile. Compared to the 50 or so you've got, we've got about 5. Interesting. I began my own work at Cambridge. In fact, Hugh was my internal thesis examiner. But since then, I've worked in very many areas, including what they now want us to call applied military history. And in relation to your keynote speech, a couple of comments on that. First of all, I think I can suggest that a major problem occurred, which you didn't refer to at all, about a generation ago. It's hard to put an exact date on it, where British universities in particular saw a separation between traditional history degrees and new degrees in politics and international relations. And that separation between the two subjects, it's now being argued, depriving people who qualify in politics, international relations, and so on, and particularly in emerging theories of cultural approaches, is now a major problem which needs to be addressed. And before the answer, this is exactly what Professor Howard had in mind in creating war studies as a more encompassing area. Your references, apart from being very Atlanticist, were all to a very narrow elite triangle, the Oxford, Cambridge, London links. And as you began, military history has very wide popular interest. It all has lots of different applications. Outside that, if I could just throw out a few names that occurred to me, Arthur Marwick or Philip M. Taylor or Paddy Griffith, not all of whom would like to be referred to as military historians, certainly, but have had immense influence, both on the broader study of military history and on various applications to it. And I get the feeling increasingly that the Oxford-Cambridge-London triangle just doesn't recognise the existence of perhaps 2/3 of military history taking place in this country at the moment. I'm afraid I thought your paper reflected that.
And I did think one of the things that occurred to me that I found kind of hard to consider how to weave in was that there is some of these divisions are sort of necessarily a little bit artificial, and in sort of cleaving to them, you do a disservice to the fact that there is crossover between what you might consider academic military history and the military history that gets was traditionally written for people who work in staff colleges. And that if you cleave too close to these divisions, you miss out on the fact that things like John Keegan's Face of War, which is tremendously influential, is written by someone who doesn't work within the university system, and yet still has a massive effect on the way that the discipline comes to look.
Hi, Lawrence Friedman. Thanks very much for that. First, just on Hugh's point, I mean, Francois Eisbourg did a big study for the French a couple of decades ago on why they hadn't got war studies going. And I think it's just the way that all universities get organised in these places, as much as intellectual traditions, but it has been an issue for them. The issue, I think the really interesting issue that's come out is this question between war studies and military history, or war history and military history. And I think Stephen just read one part of it, which is there's an increasing disconnect with international relations. Because if you look back, the great figures in international relations of the 40s, 50s, into the 60s had a historical background. I mean, they approached the subject historically. That's not the case really anymore. They just approached the subject, one could argue, econometrically, or certainly with a strong social science bias. So that's pulled away. A lot of people who are working on war, consider themselves to be working on war, rarely on the conduct of war. So if you look at the social science output on war, there's lots on its origins, there's a certain amount on its resolution and aftermath, there's very little on its conduct. And so I think that is one part of it. The other part, just to ask what your views are, is the role of the staff colleges. Again, Stephen just mentioned John Keegan. He was obviously at Sandhurst when he wrote Face of Battle. But you could argue in the US, the staff colleges have provided a safe haven for military historians, whereas, DSD itself was partly modelled on that, and on the very tiny Greenwich department, which kept the flag of maritime history flying when again not flying very many other places. So the recognition in the staff colleges that they can do more than operational history seems to me to have been quite an important part of preserving something.
I mean, especially as far as DSD goes, I think that's the idea that you do that you are sort of expected to produce something that is more than applied military history, if you like, is to my mind something that is actually a fairly recent output. And though, in the States and in certain parts of the UK, staff college setups have provided a shelter for military historians that they might not have had elsewhere. I think, we do have to admit that by and large that also tends to shape the kind of history that those historians actually end up producing. And one of the things I did actually want to say, but didn't sort of get the chance to do it, was that actually the Defence Studies Department is quite an interesting example in that increasingly, it is a sort of a forum in which that idea of it being permissible to do something that is much more, if you like, traditional in terms of how you approach military history, and it's how instructive it can be for the military, is tempered by also a greater move on the part of academics and a greater acceptance on the part of the military that actually some of the sort of broader utility of military history is useful and something that should be encouraged within that setup as well.
We'll take one more question for the first session.
Joe Moretz. Just picking up from what Professor Sir Lawrence Friedman said, in the British experience, particularly in the early part of the 20th century, the fact that military history did not have a home per se at university, did not mean that the university was not engaged with the services. And you particularly see the academics going to the Naval Staff College, going to the Imperial Defense College, and bringing their expertise to the users of military history. And I think culturally it's important to understand that the services looked to develop their future staff officers to have that historical mind so they could apply the principles of the past, right, to the future problem. And I think it's, I guess you would say, a byproduct of the downsizing of militaries that has seen in the growth of the academy where this is being done, because they've looked to outsource this and acquire that expertise there. So I think there was a shift that went on following the Second World War, you know, with the retreat from empire and with the downsizing of militaries, that you see this growth in Britain in the academic study of military history. But it was there, it was in the services though, being done by people like Rose at Cambridge, who the most popular course in the 3 to 4 years at the Navy centered junior officers who had not completed their studies at Dartmouth. They sent them to Cambridge following the World War. The most popular course there was his course on naval history. Okay? I think you can look at others. Pierce Higgins, again, famous international lawyer, right, who came to the staff colleges and spoke to them on the legal implications and of blockade and capture of private property at sea. Or you can look at economists like Fell, okay, in his association, first with the senior war course of the Navy and then at the Imperial Defense College. I mean, these things were being taken from the academy and brought to the services.
I can only agree.
Okay, good stuff. So we've a narrative of perhaps a marginal pursuit with caveats, some question marks over why that might be the case, and I guess an open question, what's to be done? And that, I hope, is what we'll talk about in the next few panels. Danny is here. She's going to show us the way to some coffee, hopefully some biscuits. If anybody needs a break, the toilets are down towards the entrance where you came in, and there's another set of toilets that away and down the stairs on your right. All right, good stuff. Let's try and make this 15 minutes, please.